Well, hello and welcome to the next in our series, looking through Luke's Gospel. If you'd like to join in with me, follow along in the Bible. We're in Luke chapter 5 today, and we're looking at verses 33 to 39. So I'm just going to read those verses now. So Luke 5, 33 to 39. They said to him, which is Jesus, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so did the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking. And Jesus answered, Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and in those days they will fast. He told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins, and no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for they say the old is better. Some interesting verses here, and it takes a little bit of work to understand actually what these verses actually mean. So I'll just take it verse by verse. And so if you want to follow along, you might find it helpful just to look at the verses as we go through. So remember the background here that Jesus has been invited to dinner with the tax collector. The tax collector, having been called from his booth to follow Jesus, and leaves his booth straight away. And that's probably Matthew, the same Matthew who wrote Matthew's Gospel. And then the Pharisees have wanted to catch Jesus out. They don't like Jesus. So any opportunity to have a go at Jesus, to fault find with Jesus, they do. So hence they ask him this question here. Well, John's disciples, that's John the Baptist's disciples, often fast and pray. So do the disciples of the Pharisees. Well, how come yours are eating and drinking? So they're spotting a difference here. Jesus' disciples have gone to a banquet and are eating and celebrating. Well, hang on a minute. John the Baptist's disciples, they're often known for their fasting, and also the disciples of the Pharisees would fast. So they're saying to Jesus, well, you're not doing what you're supposed to do here. Your disciples are feasting when they should be fasting. And what does Jesus say here? Well, verse 34, Jesus answered, Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. In those days, they will fast. So what does this actually mean? Well, Jesus is saying, well, think of a wedding. What happens at a wedding? Is a wedding a time for a fast? And obviously the answer to that is no. Usually when you have a wedding, there's a big feast. When the bridegroom and the bride is around you, have the cake, you cut the cake, you have dinner, all those things, or lunch or afternoon tea, whatever it might be. And so you don't fast during a wedding. So Jesus is giving this picture here of a wedding. And a wedding is a celebration. You don't fast during a celebration. So Jesus is giving a little illustration or parable here to say, well, um, you can't fast when a wedding feast is happening. It just doesn't fit. And so Jesus is pointing out here that he is the bridegroom. He's with them now. And so the presence of the bridegroom means no fasting. So if Jesus is the bridegroom, you might be thinking, well, who's the bride? What's the wedding? Well, the bride is actually the church, God's people. And if you like, the wedding is actually achieved through Jesus' death, ultimately, because that's the uniting of the bride, which is the church, God's people, to Christ, is done through the cross. And so Jesus mentions that and saying, well, by the time the bridegroom will be taken away, in those days they will fast. So when Jesus, if you like, is taken away, crucified, then there will be fasting. But now when the bridegroom, Jesus, is present, then there shouldn't be fasting. So he's pointing out the difference between his way that he leads his disciples and the way others are led. So, okay, what's the next little bit of the parable? Well, he then tells another parable to illustrate what's going on. In fact, two parables, one about sowing and one about wineskins. Again, we need to know a little bit about the sort of culture and times to understand what this actually means. Some of you who are sewers will probably understand the first one straight away, that if there's a problem with a garment, what you don't do is put a new patch of cloth onto the old garment. Why not? Because obviously the new patch has not been washed before, has not been worn before, and so what will often happen when it's put onto an old garment is that it will rip and tear the old garment. So what Jesus is saying was actually there's something new going on here. You don't, if you like, take the new patch, which is Jesus and his teaching, and add it onto the old, which is the teaching of the Pharisees, the teaching of Judaism, the sort of the Old Testament teaching. As if you're not patching that on to the Old Testament. Actually, something new is happening with Jesus. And the same point is made by the second parable about the wineskins, because what happens back in those days, they used to keep wine in skins, animal skins, and hence the wine and the skins would age together. But if you suddenly took an old wineskin that used to have old wine in it, start putting new wine in it, and the wine obviously starts fermenting, it can burst the skins and everything gets ruined. So again, making the same point, you don't add on something new to the old, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So Jesus is making the point generally, something new is happening here. Jesus, the bridegroom, is present and something new is happening. And again, he makes the same point in verse 39, which is perhaps slightly more difficult to understand. And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. Now, I'm sure we can think of many people these days who would say, well, the good old days and things were better in the old times, and old things weren't better than some of this new technology. And it seems to be that was a proverb at the time. The old is better. And he quotes that proverb to say, well, this is one of the reasons why the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious teachers of the time, don't seem to be wanting to follow Jesus. They prefer the old. They don't want the new. They're quite comfortable as things were, and they don't like Jesus coming along, shaking things up. They want to stick to the, if you like, a good dose of that old time religion, as it were. They don't trust Jesus. They don't like Jesus. They don't agree with what he's offering. And so therefore they want to stick with the old, and hence their opposition to Jesus. So overall, what is going on here? Well, Jesus is making the general point that he ushers in something new. This is not just an add-on to the old Judaism, the old Jewish religion. Jesus is not, if you like, the cherry on the top of the cake to make the cake complete. This is going to be something totally new. This is a new cake. And what is actually new? Well, we have to go back to one of the themes of the Bible, which is the word covenant or agreement with God. Jesus is going to bring in a new covenant. And obviously, the word covenant, we often will see the word testament in our Bible, New Testament and Old Testament. That's the word covenant. And Jesus ushers in the new covenant, remember, with the words when he gives what is the Last Supper, or we know as communion or the Eucharist, where Jesus said, this is the blood of the new covenant. So something new is going on. Jesus is replacing the old sacrificial system where they offered animals down the temple with his own body is the new sacrifice that's offered. He said, this is the new covenant, and the new covenant is in the blood of Jesus, not in the blood of goats and bulls. So that's one of the ways that Jesus is bringing in something new. So this is a challenge to the Pharisees, the religious people at the time. Something new is happening, but they don't like it and they don't want to go along with it. However, obviously, the something new is from God, and it's Jesus himself, who is God's Son, who brings this in and says, this is the way that things are now going. This is the new covenant that's going to replace what was there before. So this is a big threat, obviously, to the Pharisees, their way of doing things, and obviously it's going to culminate at the end of the gospel in Jesus losing his life, given over to death on trumped up charges, handed over to the Romans, because ultimately this dislike of Jesus at this point ends up with them hating him and actually wanting him dead by the end of the gospel. So we've reached the end of chapter 5. We're going to continue again next time by looking at Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath, and again see the difference between old and new. And so I hope you'll tune in again for the next episode as we look through Luke's Gospel.